Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back roughly 1,000 years, peeling off our modern assumptions along with our modern conveniences, and climbing, fully clothed in ignorance, as most of us are, into the surprisingly steamy, occasionally fragrant, and genuinely fascinating world of medieval bathing. Picture it for a moment. A wooden tub the size of a generous armchair, filled with water that took 3 servants and roughly 2 hours of fire tending to heat. The steam curls upward in lazy ribbons. Someone has scattered rose petals on the surface. There is wine on a small table nearby, and a musician is plucking something gentle in the corner. You are not suffering. You are not cowering in filth. You are, in fact, having a rather lovely Thursday evening in 14th century France, and you smell considerably better than you probably imagined you would. Here is your reality check for the night. The medieval person you are about to spend the next hour or so drifting off with had a more nuanced, more ritualized, and in many ways more thoughtful relationship with their own body and its cleanliness than the phrase Dark Ages would ever dare suggest. The Dark Ages, it turns out, were not particularly dark when it came to soap. You, on the other hand, might not have survived the water heating process. Hauling cauldrons is hard work, and you have gotten very soft. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world people are winding down tonight. Whether you are tucked into a flat in Edinburgh at midnight or sprawled on a couch in Manila at 2 a.m., you are very welcome here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing, for a moment, at the edge of everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. The word medieval tends to conjure a very particular smell in the modern imagination. Something between a barnyard and a blocked drain, seasoned lightly with despair. Popular culture has been enthusiastic about this image. Films set in the period make sure the extras are mud-caked. Novels describe streets thick with refuse. The shorthand has become so familiar that most people accept it without question. Medieval Europe was dirty, medieval people were dirty, and nobody bathed from roughly the fall of Rome until someone invented deodorant sometime around the Industrial Revolution. That story is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in a few minor details. It is comprehensively, entertainingly, almost impressively wrong. And unwinding it is going to take us on a journey through Roman ruins and monastery gardens, through the steaming chaos of public bathhouses and the perfumed privacy of royal chambers, through plague wards and soap markets and herbal recipe books written by monks who cared, with remarkable passion, about the smell of their own hair. By the time we reach the end of tonight's story, you will have a completely different picture of medieval hygiene, and you will probably feel a complicated kind of respect for people who manage to stay clean without hot running water, synthetic shampoo, or a shower that responds to voice commands. But let us begin at the beginning, which is to say, let us begin with the myth itself. Where did this idea come from? Why do we so confidently assume that the medieval world was a realm of unwashed bodies and cheerful ignorance about personal hygiene? The answer, as with most historical misconceptions, is that it came from somewhere real and then got dramatically exaggerated along the way, passed down through centuries of storytelling until the exaggeration became the accepted version and the reality was buried underneath it like a bar of soap at the bottom of a very cloudy tub. The seed of the myth was planted, in part, by the people who came after the Middle Ages. Renaissance thinkers, eager to distinguish their own enlightened era from the supposedly barbaric centuries preceding it, had every rhetorical incentive to paint the medieval period as a time of ignorance and squalor. If the people before you were filthy and brutish, then your own age of reason and art looks considerably more impressive by contrast. This is not unique to the Renaissance. Every era tends to flatten the one before it into a useful foil, and the Middle Ages got flattened harder than most. The myth was then enthusiastically picked up by 19th century writers and scholars, who were grappling with their own complicated feelings about industrialization, urbanization, and the direction of so-called progress. Romanticizing the medieval period meant emphasizing its supposed primitiveness on some fronts while idealizing its chivalry and spiritual grandeur on others. The result was a portrait that was always more about the present than the past, a medieval world built from the anxieties and aspirations of whatever era happened to be writing about it. And then, of course, came Hollywood. And once Hollywood decided that medieval peasants should be mud-smeared and medieval nobles should be brooding in drafty stone halls without so much as a washbasin in sight, the image was essentially cemented. It is very difficult to dislodge a visual impression, especially one that has been reinforced by approximately 10,000 fantasy films and television series over the course of a century. So here you are, standing at the edge of the real medieval world, and the first thing you notice, the very first thing before we get into the tubs and the bathhouses and the elaborate soap recipes, is that the people who actually lived through this period wrote about bathing constantly. They left behind manuals of household management that include detailed instructions for preparing baths. They wrote medical texts that prescribed bathing for a dizzying range of ailments. They composed courtesy literature, the etiquette guides of their day, that assumed regular washing was a basic social expectation. They built bathhouses into their monasteries and their castles and their cities. They imported soap and traded in aromatic oils and argued, in learned academic texts, about the correct water temperature for various therapeutic purposes. These are not the records of people who didn't know that cleanliness existed. These are the records of people who thought about it carefully, who organized their lives around it in ways that were shaped by their particular circumstances, their available technology, their medical beliefs, and their social values, but who were, by any reasonable measure, engaged in a genuine and sustained effort to keep themselves clean. The mainstream historical fact that anchors us here, the one that tends to most reliably short-circuit the medieval people were filthy assumption, is this: public bathhouses, establishments dedicated specifically to bathing, open to ordinary townspeople, often offering hot water and steam, were a standard feature of medieval European urban life from at least the 12th century onward. In Paris, at one point in the 13th century, there were reportedly more than 24 bathhouses operating within the city limits. London had its Southwark stews. German cities had their Badestube, so numerous and so popular that city governments had to issue regulations governing their hours of operation. These were not exotic luxuries available only to the wealthy. They were, in many cities, as ordinary and expected a part of weekly life as going to market. Now, historians still argue whether medieval bathing frequency was consistent across seasons, social classes, and geographic regions, or whether the documentary evidence we have, which skews heavily toward urban, literate, and elite sources, overstates how widespread regular bathing actually was. This is a genuinely unresolved question, and it matters because the records we have are inevitably incomplete. A 12th century Parisian bathhouse master left records. A 12th century peasant in rural Burgundy did not. We are, as always, working with what survived, and what survived was written by people who could write, which means we have to be careful about how far we generalize. But even accounting for that caution, the picture is dramatically different from the myth. The baseline was not filth and ignorance. The baseline was a culture that valued cleanliness, that made genuine efforts to achieve it under the considerable practical constraints of the era, and that had a rich and varied set of rituals, tools, and social institutions organized around the project of keeping the human body in a state that was considered presentable, healthy, and appropriate. Here is the quirky tidbit that tends to make people blink. One of the earliest and most persistent cleanliness rituals in medieval European culture was not about the body at all. It was about the hands. Specifically, the ritual washing of hands before meals was so deeply embedded in medieval social expectation that failure to perform it was considered not just unhygienic but morally suspect. Courtesy manuals from the 12th century onward hammer this point with almost anxious insistence. You wash your hands before you sit down to eat. You wash your hands again after. If you are a guest at someone's table and you reach for food without first being offered water for washing, something has gone badly wrong with the hospitality of your host. The hands were, in medieval hygienic thinking, a kind of constant moral and physical frontier, the part of the body most in contact with the world, most likely to carry contamination, most urgently in need of regular attention. This preoccupation with the hands gives you a useful window into the broader medieval logic of cleanliness. It was not random. It was not absent. It was organized according to a set of priorities and beliefs that were different from ours, shaped by different medical understanding, different religious frameworks, different social hierarchies, but it was coherent. It made sense within its own terms. And as you settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting tonight, that is the idea I want you to carry into everything that follows. Medieval bathing culture was not the absence of our culture. It was a different culture, with its own logic, its own tools, its own pleasures, and its own remarkably strong opinions about what it meant to be clean. You are about to meet people who heated water with careful patience, who perfumed it with lavender and rose and chamomile, who soaked in it for hours with friends and family, who debated the medical benefits of warm versus cold immersion, who built elaborate wooden tubs and marble basins and communal steam rooms, and who would have found the modern habit of standing under a torrent of water for exactly 7 minutes before rushing out the door to be, frankly, a little barbaric. Welcome to the world they built. The water is warm, the steam is rising, and we are only just getting started. The story of medieval bathing really cannot be told without first spending a moment. A slow, comfortable, dimly lit moment, inside the actual physical experience of what it meant to prepare a bath in this era, because the preparation itself tells you almost everything you need to know about how seriously people took it. You do not, in the medieval world, walk into a bathroom and turn a handle. There is no handle. There is no bathroom in the modern sense of a dedicated, plumbed room built specifically for washing. What there is, in a reasonably prosperous household, is a wooden tub, typically barrel-shaped, sometimes lined with linen cloth to prevent splinters from introducing themselves to your person in an unwelcome way, and a fire and water, and the human labor required to bring these three things together in useful combination. The water comes from a well, a river, a rainwater cistern, or, if you are lucky enough to live in a city with one, a public conduit. It is carried in buckets or pots, and it is cold. Getting it hot means heating it over a fire, which means tending the fire, which means gathering or purchasing fuel, which means that the entire enterprise of having a bath is, before a drop of water has touched your skin, already a logistical operation of some complexity. In a castle or a wealthy manor, this labor falls to servants, and the bath itself is accordingly a more frequent and more comfortable event. In a smaller household, it is a communal project. Everyone contributes to the heating, and then, sensibly, everyone takes a turn in the same water because you absolutely did not heat all that water just to tip it out after one person. This practice of shared bathwater, incidentally, is one of the details that later commentators seized on as evidence of medieval barbarism. The image of an entire family bathing in sequence in the same tub, the water growing progressively murkier, the last person in getting something of a raw deal. But the reality is more nuanced than the joke. The order of bathing was typically organized by status, the head of the household first, then other adults, then children, and the water was generally replenished with hot water between turns, or at least between the more significant ones. The linen lining of the tub served partly as a kind of filter, and frankly, the logic of shared bathwater in an era of significant fuel cost and significant labor investment is not barbarism. It is resource management. It is, in its own way, rather practical. The tub itself was a more varied object than you might imagine. At the simplest end, you have a large barrel, halved or modified, perfectly functional and entirely unglamorous. At the more prosperous end, you have something that begins to look almost luxurious. A deep wooden tub, sometimes with a canopy overhead to hold the steam in, sometimes with a small built-in seat or ledge so the bather can recline in relative comfort, sometimes draped with cloth to retain heat and create a sense of enclosure and privacy. Illuminated manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries, those gorgeous, meticulously detailed illustrations in the margins of religious and secular texts, show us bathing scenes with a frequency and casual ease that suggests the bath was a perfectly normal part of life, not remarkable enough to require special commentary, just a thing that happened like eating or praying or riding a horse. In these images, you see people bathing alone and together, bathing while being served food and drink, bathing while musicians play nearby. You see attendants pouring water and adding flowers and herbs. You see expressions of relaxed contentment that are instantly recognizable across the distance of 800 years. These are not images of reluctant scrubbing. These are images of people who are enjoying themselves, who have arranged their bathing time as a kind of leisure, who understand that the bath is not just a hygienic necessity but a pleasure worth cultivating. The herbs and additives scattered on the surface of the water were not merely decorative, though they were certainly that too. Medieval medical thinking, informed by the classical tradition inherited from Greco-Roman physicians, particularly the enormous shadow cast by Galen and, later, the Arabic scholars who preserved and extended his work, understood the bath as a therapeutic tool of considerable power. Hot baths were considered to open the pores, release harmful humors, and relax the muscles and the nerves. Certain herbs were believed to have specific medical properties that could be absorbed through the skin during bathing. Rosemary was good for the memory and the heart. Chamomile soothed inflammation and calmed anxiety. Lavender was good for the head. Rose petals softened the skin and lifted the spirits. Mint was invigorating. Wormwood was for parasites, though you would hope the need for wormwood in your bath was not a regular occurrence. This is the point where the medieval bath begins to look less like a primitive approximation of our own habits and more like something that modern wellness culture would enthusiastically rebrand and charge considerable money for. A hot soak infused with therapeutic herbs, followed by a period of rest, with attention paid to the body's responses and the relationship between physical comfort and mental well-being. That is a spa experience. That is, in the language of contemporary self-care, a whole thing. The medieval bather was not fumbling toward cleanliness in the dark. The medieval bather was engaging in a practice that was medically sophisticated by the standards of its era, socially embedded, and genuinely pleasurable. You settle a little further into your pillow as that image takes shape. The wooden tub, the steam, the herbs floating on the surface, the candle somewhere nearby, the musician plucking something unhurried in the corner. The medieval world, at its bathing best, was not a world of hardship and neglect. It was a world of deliberate, careful, pleasurable attention to the body, organized around tools and beliefs that were different from ours but no less serious in their intentions. And of course, and here is where the light sarcasm must make its first gentle appearance, it was also a world of considerable variation. The king's rose-petal bath was not the peasant's bucket of river water, and we should not romanticize the whole picture into uniform comfort. Class, geography, season, access to fuel, access to water, and simple luck all shaped what any individual's experience of bathing actually looked like. The story we are telling tonight is a story of a whole civilization across several centuries, and that civilization contained multitudes, from the perfumed leisure of the aristocracy to the quick, cold, entirely pragmatic wash of a field laborer on a winter morning. But the baseline, the cultural assumption, the thing that medieval European society took for granted in a way that the myth completely obscures, that baseline was that cleanliness mattered. It mattered medically. It mattered spiritually. It mattered socially. Smelling bad was not considered inevitable or acceptable. Looking unkempt was a social statement, and usually not one you wanted to be making. The people of medieval Europe had opinions about personal hygiene, strong ones, and they organized significant portions of their material culture and their daily lives around acting on those opinions. As you begin to let the day go, to let the weight of your own particular Thursday or Friday or whatever day this is for you start to dissolve into the warmth of wherever you are resting, carry that image with you. Not the mud and the misery of the popular myth, but the steam and the herbs and the careful, unhurried attention to the body that is, it turns out, one of the most human things the Middle Ages had to offer. We have barely begun. There is so much more to discover. Bathhouses and bishops, soap traders and plague doctors, peasants and queens, and the long, complicated story of how a civilization that cared deeply about being clean gradually forgot that it ever did. But for now, just breathe in the imaginary steam and let the story carry you forward into the next chapter of a world that was, in this one important and often overlooked way, a great deal more civilized than we gave it credit for. The Romans left behind a problem. Not the only problem they left behind, obviously. They also left behind a collapsed administrative infrastructure, several thousand miles of roads in varying states of disrepair, and a legal tradition complicated enough to keep scholars arguing for the next 2,000 years. But for our purposes tonight, the most immediately relevant problem was this: they left behind their bathhouses. Enormous, magnificent, bewilderingly complex bathhouses that had, at their peak, served tens of thousands of people per day, that had featured heated floors and cold plunge pools and warm intermediate rooms and libraries and exercise yards and snack bars. Actual snack bars, because the Romans understood that a good bathing session works up an appetite, and that now, as the Western Empire crumbled and the administrative machinery that had kept them running ground to a halt, stood as monuments to a standard of communal cleanliness that the inheriting civilization had absolutely no idea how to maintain. You are standing, in your imagination, at the edge of one of these structures sometime in the 5th or 6th century. The baths of Caracalla in Rome, which at their height could accommodate perhaps 8,000 bathers simultaneously in a complex covering around 11 hectares, are already beginning their long slide into ruin. The hypocaust system, the ingenious underfloor heating network that circulated hot air beneath the mosaic tiles, warming the floor and the rooms above, requires constant maintenance, skilled engineers, and a reliable supply of fuel. The aqueducts that fed the complex with fresh water require inspection, repair, and the kind of organized civic investment that becomes very difficult to sustain when your central government is experiencing what historians politely call a period of significant political instability, and what everyone living through it probably called something considerably less polite. The maintenance stops, the engineers disperse, the aqueducts crack and silt up and eventually stop delivering water with anything like their former reliability. The fires in the hypocaust go out. The mosaic floors, no longer warmed from below, grow cold and then begin to crack as water seeps in and freezes and expands with the patient indifference of physics. The magnificent vaulted ceilings, engineering marvels that they were, begin the long process of becoming rubble. And the people who might once have used these spaces, who had, in many cases, quite literally been born into a world where a visit to the public baths was as routine as breakfast, have to figure out what comes next. What comes next is a very long negotiation between a lost ideal and a new reality, and that negotiation shapes medieval bathing culture in ways that echo all the way to the end of the period and beyond. The Romans had, in a sense, set a standard so extraordinary that almost nothing that followed could match it, and the medieval world spent centuries working out its complicated feelings about that fact, sometimes imitating the Roman model as closely as available resources allowed, sometimes repurposing Roman bathing infrastructure for entirely different uses, sometimes simply mourning the loss in the particular way that cultures mourn things, which is to say by writing about them with a nostalgia so intense it becomes almost painful to read. Because the loss was real and it was significant. The Roman bathing system had been a genuine feat of social engineering as well as architectural engineering. It had made regular bathing accessible to enormous numbers of people regardless of personal wealth, because the baths were typically state-subsidized and open to all free citizens at little or no cost. You did not need to own a tub, or have servants to heat your water, or have access to a private well. You simply went to the baths as everyone went to the baths, as going to the baths was simply what you did. When that infrastructure collapsed, the default shifted from institutional access to personal resource, and personal resources in the fragmented, frequently chaotic world of early medieval Europe were considerably less evenly distributed. This is the mainstream historical fact that anchors this part of our story. The collapse of Roman bathing infrastructure in the western provinces represents one of the most significant practical disruptions to everyday hygienic life in European history. Historians of material culture have documented, through archaeological evidence, the dramatic decline in both the number and the scale of bathing facilities in the former Western Empire between roughly the 5th and 7th centuries. Cities that had maintained multiple large public bath complexes were reduced, in many cases, to a single smaller facility or none at all. The logistical chains, the quarried stone, the skilled craftspeople, the organized fuel supply, the maintained aqueducts, simply could not be replicated without the administrative and economic machinery of empire to sustain them. But here is where the story gets interesting, because the medieval world did not simply sit in the ruins and give up. The response to the loss of Roman bathing infrastructure was varied, creative, and in some cases genuinely impressive, a series of adaptations that took the basic human desire to be clean and found new ways to satisfy it within the constraints of a very different kind of civilization. In some places, Roman bath buildings were repurposed rather than abandoned. The thick walls and vaulted spaces of former bath complexes made excellent raw material for other structures. Churches, in particular, were sometimes built into or directly out of former bathing buildings, which creates the slightly vertiginous historical experience of realizing that you are praying in what used to be a hot room. In other places, smaller, simpler bath structures were built in the Roman tradition but scaled to what was actually achievable: less marble, less engineering ambition, more wood and local stone, but still functioning, still heated, still serving a genuine social purpose. The monasteries, which we will explore in more detail when we reach our section on the Church's role in all of this, preserved and adapted Roman bathing culture with particular seriousness. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational document of Benedictine monasticism written in the 6th century, includes specific provisions about bathing, provisions that assume bathing to be a normal and necessary part of human life while also placing it within a framework of monastic discipline and communal care. Monks bathed. The sick were bathed as part of their care. The elderly were bathed because their bodies required it. These were not controversial propositions. They were institutional commitments, written into the founding rules of the most influential monastic movement in Western Europe, and they meant that the monastery became, among its many other functions, a site of preserved and practiced bathing culture throughout the early medieval period. And then there is the question of what happened in the parts of Europe where Roman influence had never penetrated as deeply, the Germanic territories, Scandinavia, the Celtic fringes, because these regions had their own indigenous bathing traditions that did not depend on Roman infrastructure and did not collapse when Roman infrastructure did. The Germanic peoples, whom Roman writers had taken such pains to describe as barbaric, turned out to have quite robust bathing practices of their own. The sauna tradition of Northern Europe, the use of a small, enclosed, heavily heated space to produce intense sweating, often followed by immersion in cold water, is ancient, pre-Roman, and deeply embedded in the cultures of what would become medieval Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic regions. When these peoples became part of the medieval European world through conquest, migration, and conversion, they brought their bathing traditions with them, and those traditions cross-pollinated with the Mediterranean inheritance in ways that historians still find genuinely interesting to trace. Historians still argue whether the sauna tradition of Northern Europe influenced the development of the steam bath and sweat bath culture that appears in medieval German and Slavic communities, or whether these were independent parallel developments arising from the same basic human discovery that hot enclosed spaces make you sweat productively. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive either way, which is the kind of historical situation that tends to generate very enjoyable academic disagreements. What we can say with confidence is that by the time the early medieval period begins to give way to the high medieval period, roughly from the 10th century onward, as European civilization begins to stabilize, urbanize, and develop the economic complexity that supports more sophisticated material culture, bathing is everywhere. Not everywhere in the Roman sense of enormous state-subsidized complexes, but everywhere in the sense that it is assumed, expected, practiced, and talked about. The documentary record thickens with references to bathing facilities, bathing habits, and bathing etiquette. City records begin to mention bathhouses as established fixtures of urban life. Household manuals assume the existence of bathing equipment. Medical texts expand their discussion of therapeutic bathing in considerable detail. The Roman hangover, you begin to realize, was not primarily a hangover of loss. It was a hangover of aspiration, the ghost of an extraordinary standard that the medieval world could not quite match but could not quite forget either, and that haunted its thinking about cleanliness and the body and the proper relationship between civilization and hygiene in ways both productive and occasionally paralyzing. There is a quirky footnote to this story of Roman influence that tends to delight people when they first encounter it. In several early medieval texts, particularly those written by clerics who had access to classical literature and who were doing their best to make sense of the world they had inherited, you find references to Roman bathing practices that have clearly been filtered through several layers of misunderstanding and cultural translation. A monk in 8th century Northumbria describing the Roman baths he has read about but never seen produces a description that is recognizably based on real information but inflected with the particular imaginative limitations of someone who has never experienced anything like it. The marble he understands. The hot water he understands. The social mixing, the scale, the libraries, the snack bars. These details arrive in his text slightly distorted, like a message passed through too many hands, still recognizable but changed in small ways that tell you everything about the distance between the world being described and the world doing the describing. That distance, the gap between the Roman ideal and the medieval reality, was not a gap of ignorance or indifference. It was a gap of circumstance. The medieval world knew what the Romans had achieved. It had the texts, or many of them. It had the ruins, inescapably present in the landscape of former Roman territory. It had the desire to match or exceed what had come before, as every civilization has the desire to measure itself against its predecessors. What it lacked was the specific infrastructure, the engineering capacity, the centralized organization, the economic surplus that had made the Roman baths possible in the first place. So it improvised. It adapted. It invented new solutions and borrowed old ones and cross-pollinated traditions and muddled through with the resources it had, which were sometimes considerable and sometimes not. And in doing so, it built a bathing culture that was genuinely its own. Not the Roman model, not a failed imitation of the Roman model, but something new, something medieval, something shaped by the particular conditions of its own time and place and possibility. You feel the weight of those Roman ruins somewhere in the background of everything that follows tonight. Those cold, magnificent, slowly disintegrating testaments to what hot water and good engineering can achieve when a civilization decides to make them a priority. They are not depressing, exactly. They are motivating in a slightly melancholy way, the way that any great lost thing is motivating. A reminder of what is possible, a challenge to the present, a standard against which every subsequent generation of bathers has had to measure itself, usually while standing in a wooden tub and trying to decide whether to add more hot water or just accept that this is fine. It is fine, the medieval European eventually decides. It is not the baths of Caracalla, but it is warm and clean and rather pleasant, and there are herbs on the surface of the water and someone is playing a lute somewhere, and honestly, given everything, this is not so bad at all. The city is beginning to grow again. The bathhouses are beginning to multiply. And the really interesting part of the story, the full flowering of medieval bathing culture in all its social complexity, is just around the corner, waiting for us in a loud, steamy, surprisingly entertaining establishment that the medieval world knew as the stew house, and that we will visit together in just a moment. But for now, breathe. Let the Roman ruins settle into the background of your imagination, magnificent and melancholy and slowly being reclaimed by grass. The story is moving forward, the way stories always do, toward something warmer and considerably more crowded and alive. The noise hits you first. Before the steam, before the smell of wood smoke and heated water and whatever herbal concoction the proprietor has decided to add to the tubs this week. Before any of the visual details resolve themselves into something coherent. It is the noise that announces the medieval bathhouse most emphatically and most unmistakably. Voices, dozens of them, overlapping in the easy, uninhibited way of people who are relaxed and warm and not particularly concerned with maintaining the dignified social distance that colder, more formal environments demand. Laughter, the specific kind of laughter that happens when people are comfortable enough to find things genuinely funny rather than politely amusing. The slap of water against wood. The clatter of attendants moving buckets and linens. Somewhere, almost certainly, someone is singing because medieval people sang the way modern people scroll through their phones, constantly, reflexively, as a default response to having a spare moment and no immediate crisis to manage. You are standing at the entrance of a medieval bathhouse, and the first thing it is important for you to understand is that this is not a solemn place. This is not a place of hushed reverence or careful privacy or the particular kind of mild anxiety that characterizes the modern gym changing room, where everyone is aggressively pretending that no one else exists. This is a social space, unambiguously and enthusiastically social, in the same category as the tavern and the marketplace. A place where the ordinary business of human community happens to be conducted in the presence of hot water and considerably fewer clothes than usual. The medieval bathhouse went by several names depending on where in Europe you encountered it and what specific services it offered. In England, particularly in London's Southwark district, the establishments were called stews, a word derived from the Old French estouvaire, meaning to bathe in steam or heated water, and carrying none of the modern English connotations that the word has since accumulated, though we will get to the complicated question of exactly what services some of these establishments offered a little later, because it is relevant and also mildly entertaining. In France, they were étuves. In German-speaking territories, Badestube or Badehouse. In Italian cities, Bagni Pubblici. The names varied, but the basic concept was consistent. A dedicated establishment, open to paying customers, providing hot water, bathing facilities, and a range of associated services that could include anything from a simple wash to a full afternoon of social leisure. The mainstream historical fact that grounds us here is one of the most reliably surprising statistics in medieval history. Paris in the 13th century, a city of perhaps 200,000 people, had somewhere in the region of 26 to 30 functioning public bathhouses operating within the city limits, not counting the bathhouses attached to hospitals, monasteries, and private noble households. This number comes from a remarkable document known as the Livre de Métiers, a register of Parisian trades and guilds compiled around 1268 by Étienne Boileau, the provost of Paris under Louis IX. The bathhouse keepers, the baigneurs, were sufficiently numerous and sufficiently organized to have their own guild, their own regulations, their own professional standards, and their own complicated relationship with the municipal authorities who were simultaneously relying on their tax revenue and worrying about what was going on inside their establishments after dark. The guild regulations for Parisian bathhouse keepers are, if you have a taste for the minutiae of medieval bureaucracy, genuinely fascinating reading. They specify when the baths must be open, typically from early morning until a specific evening hour, the exact time varying by season to account for the available daylight. They specify what charges may be levied for different services. They address the treatment of attendants and the obligations of proprietors. They insist, with the slightly weary tone of regulations that are addressing problems that have actually occurred, that no bathhouse keeper shall admit lepers to the common baths, shall operate on Sundays and feast days without specific permission, or shall allow. And here is where the regulations begin to suggest that the bathhouse's reputation for supplementary services was not entirely unearned. Certain categories of women to remain on the premises after the legitimate bathing hours have concluded. Because yes, the elephant in the steam room. The medieval bathhouse had, in many cities and across much of the period, a complicated dual reputation, as a legitimate hygienic establishment serving the genuine cleanliness needs of the urban population, and as a place where other transactions of a less strictly hygienic nature sometimes also occurred. The two functions coexisted in the same physical spaces and sometimes in the same establishments, and the boundary between them was frequently contested, frequently regulated, frequently ignored, and frequently the subject of moral commentary from people who were almost certainly exaggerating the problem for rhetorical purposes. It is worth being careful here, because the tendency to emphasize the seedier aspects of the medieval bathhouse is itself a form of the same reductive mythologizing that gave us the everyone was filthy narrative. The majority of medieval bathhouse visits in the majority of medieval bathhouses across the majority of the period were exactly what they appear to be in the guild regulations and the household manuals and the illustrated manuscripts: people going to get clean, getting clean, and going home again. The existence of some establishments where additional services were available does not transform the entire institution into something other than a bathhouse any more than the existence of some restaurants where drug deals occasionally happen transforms the entire concept of the restaurant into something other than a place to eat. But the dual reputation is real, and it shaped the bathhouse's social history in important ways. Municipal authorities across Europe spent considerable energy trying to distinguish between legitimate bathing establishments and establishments that were using the bathhouse format as cover for other activities. The results of these efforts were mixed, which is to say that the regulations were issued, periodically enforced, frequently evaded, repeatedly reissued, and eventually, as we will see when we reach the later medieval period and the Great Disruption of the Plague Years, used as a pretext for crackdowns that went considerably beyond what the actual situation warranted. For now, though, you are inside the legitimate bathhouse on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday morning in 13th century Bruges, and the experience is considerably more pleasant than any of the regulatory history might suggest. The space is organized, in most established bathhouses, around a series of wooden tubs, sometimes individual, sometimes large enough for 2 or 4 people, arranged in a main bathing room that is kept warm by a central fire or by proximity to the heating apparatus that warms the water. There is typically a steam room as well, where heated stones or a constantly tended fire produces the kind of damp, enveloping heat that opens every pore you possess and makes your muscles feel like they have been replaced with something considerably more agreeable and cooperative. The attendants, and a well-run medieval bathhouse had several, are a crucial part of the experience. They heat the water and carry it to the tubs. They provide linens for drying. In many establishments, they offer additional services that are entirely therapeutic in the legitimate sense: scrubbing the skin with various abrasive materials to remove dead cells and accumulated grime, applying soap or herbal preparations, trimming hair and beard, and the service that medieval bathing culture considered perhaps most valuable of all, cupping and bleeding, performed by barber surgeons who frequently operated out of bathhouse premises because the warm, humid environment was considered medically appropriate for such procedures, And because the combination of barber and surgeon in a single professional was one of those medieval institutional arrangements that makes modern people deeply uncomfortable but made perfect sense within the medical logic of the era. The barber-surgeon in the bathhouse is one of those details that contains an entire world. Medicine, hygiene, social service, and aesthetic care, all happening in the same warm, steamy space, performed by the same person or team of people, understood as parts of a single continuum of bodily care rather than as separate disciplines requiring separate institutions. You go to the bathhouse to be clean, yes, but also to be well, to be groomed, to be bled if your humors require balancing, to have that tooth seen to have your corns addressed. The bathhouse was, in the urban medieval context, something close to a comprehensive wellness center. And the fact that wellness centers are now considered a modern innovation tells you something about how thoroughly we managed to forget what the medieval world had quietly figured out. The social mixing that happened inside the bathhouse is worth lingering on, because it represents something genuinely unusual in a society that was otherwise organized with great attention to the maintenance of hierarchy and social distance. Medieval European society was profoundly hierarchical in ways that shaped almost every aspect of daily life. What you wore, where you sat, who you addressed first, how you were addressed in return, what you ate and drank, where you worshipped, who you married. These hierarchies were constantly performed and constantly reinforced through the visible markers of dress and comportment and social behavior. In the bathhouse, stripped of most of those markers, the performance became considerably more complicated. Not impossible, social rank asserted itself through the quality of your linen, the deference of your attendants, the question of whether you had a private tub or shared a common one, but more difficult, more permeable, more subject to the leveling force of hot water and human nakedness, which have historically been among the most effective dissolvents of artificial social distinction. Historians still argue whether the medieval bathhouse represented a genuine site of social leveling, where the barriers between classes were meaningfully lowered, or whether hierarchy simply reasserted itself through different means: the private versus public tub, the quality of the soap, the presence or absence of personal attendance, without ever truly disappearing. The answer is probably both, depending on the specific establishment, the specific city, and the specific moment in the medieval period you are examining. What seems clear is that the bathhouse created spaces for social interaction that crossed class lines in ways that most other medieval institutions did not, and that this made it simultaneously valued as a community institution and regarded with suspicion by those whose authority depended on the maintenance of clear social boundaries. Here is the quirky detail that tends to produce the most delighted reactions when people first encounter it. In many medieval German cities, the bathhouse was the traditional venue for wedding celebrations. Not the church, not the town hall, the bathhouse. Entire wedding parties would descend on the bathhouse, bathe together in a spirit of communal celebration, eat and drink in the warm, steamy atmosphere, and mark the transition from unmarried to married life with a collective immersion that combined hygienic, social, and vaguely ritual functions in a way that is both alien and completely comprehensible from a modern perspective. You want to mark an important life transition with an experience that is warm, communal, slightly transgressive of ordinary social rules, and associated with cleanliness and renewal? A bathhouse wedding makes a certain kind of perfect sense. The bathhouse day had a rhythm to it. Early morning brought the working population, craftspeople, traders, servants with a free hour, who came for efficiency, a quick wash and scrub before the day's labor began in earnest. The middle of the day brought a more leisurely clientele, those with the time and the means to treat the bath as a social occasion rather than a practical necessity. Late afternoon and early evening brought another wave, the end-of-workday crowd, and this is when the noise and the sociability peaked, when the wine and food that many bathhouses offered to their customers alongside the hot water really came into their own, when the bathhouse most clearly revealed itself as a social institution rather than merely a hygienic one. As you imagine yourself in that warm, crowded, gloriously unself-conscious space, the voices overlapping, the steam curling upward, the smell of wood smoke and herbs, and the particular clean smell of heated water, you might notice something settling in you, some quiet recognition. This is a human thing, this gathering in warm water, this mixing and talking and laughing in a space defined by the shared vulnerability of cleanliness. It is old, older than the medieval period, probably as old as the first human being who noticed that hot water felt good and that feeling good was better shared. The medieval bathhouse did not survive the period intact. Forces were gathering, plague, shifting medical theory, the complicated politics of Reformation morality, that would eventually close most of these establishments and transform them from routine urban fixtures into scandalous memories. But that story belongs to a later section of tonight's journey. For now, the water is still hot, the voices are still rising, someone is still singing somewhere in the steam, and the medieval bathhouse is alive and flourishing and doing what it always did best, bringing people together in the oldest, warmest, most human way imaginable. You breathe in the imaginary steam one more time and let it carry you forward, deeper into the story, toward the complicated figure of the church, which had considerably more nuanced opinions about all of this than you might expect, and which is waiting for us just beyond the steam room door with a set of views on bathing that are going to require us to rethink almost everything we thought we knew. The monk wakes before dawn. This is not unusual. The monastic day is organized around a sequence of prayer offices that begins in the small hours of the morning and structures every waking moment until Compline, the final prayer of the night, returns the community to silence and sleep. But this particular morning has an additional item on the schedule, one that the rule has anticipated and provided for with the same practical thoroughness that it brings to everything from the management of the monastery's tools to the correct posture for receiving a visiting abbot. This morning, the monk bathes, not because he has decided to, not because the impulse struck him, but because the institution has determined that it is time, that the body requires this attention, that cleanliness is a legitimate and necessary concern, and that providing for it is part of what it means to run a well-ordered Christian community. This image, the medieval monk, rising in the cold dark of a pre-dawn morning, moving toward the monastery's washing facilities with the same disciplined obedience he brings to every other aspect of his regulated life, is not the image that most people carry when they think about the church and cleanliness in the Middle Ages. The image most people carry is almost exactly the opposite: the dirty monk, the unwashed ascetic, the holy man who considers bodily hygiene a form of vanity and spiritual weakness, who wears his grime as a badge of otherworldly focus, whose indifference to the demands of the flesh extends all the way down to the soap. This image is, like so many of the images we have been examining tonight, a dramatic oversimplification of something that was genuinely complicated. The Church's relationship with bathing and bodily cleanliness in the medieval period was not simple hostility, and it was not simple endorsement. It was a sustained, theologically serious, frequently contentious negotiation between the demands of the spirit and the needs of the body. A negotiation conducted across centuries, in multiple languages, within a tradition that contained enough internal diversity to support almost any position on almost any question, including this one. Let us begin with the foundational text, because the foundational text is considerably more accommodating than the myth suggests. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and adopted as the governing document of monasticism across most of Western Europe, addresses bathing in a passage that is brief, practical, and entirely without the hairshirt severity that popular imagination tends to associate with monastic life. The sick, Benedict writes, should be allowed to bathe as often as necessary for their health. The healthy may bathe less frequently. At Christmas and Easter is the specific provision, though this refers to full immersion baths rather than the routine washing of hands and face that was expected daily. But the tone throughout is one of reasonable provision for genuine human need, not of suspicion toward the body or hostility toward cleanliness. The mainstream historical fact that matters here is this: medieval monasteries routinely included dedicated washing facilities as standard architectural features, and the care of the body, including its cleanliness, was considered an integral part of the care of the soul. The lavatorium, a communal washing space typically located adjacent to the refectory so that monks could wash their hands before meals, was a standard element of monastic design from the early period onward. Many larger monasteries also maintained proper bathing facilities, sometimes quite elaborate ones, that were used according to the schedule the rule prescribed and expanded upon by local custom. The monastery was not a site of deliberate filth. It was a site of regulated cleanliness, which is a different thing, and the difference matters enormously. The care of the sick in monastic infirmaries is particularly revealing. Medieval monastic medicine, which represented, for much of the early and high medieval period, the most organized and sophisticated medical practice available in Western Europe, understood bathing as a therapeutic tool of genuine importance. Sick monks and lay patients in monastic care were bathed regularly, their wounds cleaned, their bodies tended with an attention that was simultaneously medical and spiritual in its motivation. Caring for the sick body was understood as a form of service to God, an act of charity that honored the divine image in which the human body was believed to have been made. You cannot honor the divine image by leaving it unwashed. The logic, once you see it, is actually quite straightforward. So where does the myth of the filthy, anti-bathing church come from? It comes from several places, and they are worth identifying because they are real even if they have been dramatically overinterpreted. The first source is the tradition of ascetic Christianity, which is genuine, ancient, and genuinely extreme in some of its expressions. The Desert Fathers, the early Christian hermits and monks of Egypt and Syria, who established the first traditions of Christian monasticism in the 3rd and 4th centuries, did, in some cases, practice deliberate bodily neglect as a form of spiritual discipline. The most famous examples are almost spectacular in their commitment. Simeon Stylites living on a pillar for 37 years, various hermits competing with each other in creative forms of physical self-denial, a general cultural current that associated the body with temptation, the flesh with sin, and the deliberate mortification of physical comfort with spiritual progress. These figures were real, their influence was real, and their attitudes toward the body, including its cleanliness, were genuinely hostile in ways that left traces in Christian thought for centuries. But they were also exceptional, explicitly marked as extreme even within their own tradition, and their practices were never adopted as the standard for ordinary Christian life. The Desert Father who hadn't washed in 20 years was not a model for the average medieval Christian any more than a modern extreme athlete who runs 100 miles on no food is a model for the average modern gym-goer. He was an object of reverence and astonishment, a sign of what extraordinary spiritual dedication looked like at its furthest extreme, not a template for normal behavior. The second source of the myth is a set of patristic writings, texts by early church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, that express suspicion about certain kinds of bathing, particularly the elaborate, leisurely, socially mixed public bathing of the Roman tradition. When Tertullian warns Christian women against spending too much time at the baths, he is not saying that bathing is sinful. He is saying that the specific social environment of the Roman public bath, the mixed company, the leisure, the potential for vanity and display and encounters with men who are not your husband, presents spiritual dangers that a Christian woman should be cautious about. This is a critique of the social context of Roman bathing, not a critique of the act of washing. But it has been repeatedly misread, across centuries of subsequent interpretation, as a blanket condemnation of bodily cleanliness, which it emphatically is not. Historians still argue whether the patristic suspicion of Roman bathing culture had a measurable practical effect on bathing frequency in early Christian communities, or whether the rhetorical hostility in the texts was more about establishing moral distance from pagan Roman culture than about actually changing people's bathing habits. The evidence suggests that the latter is closer to the truth, that Christians continued to bathe much as they always had, while their intellectual leaders wrote texts that positioned Christianity as spiritually superior to the bath-obsessed paganism they were distinguishing themselves from. The text said one thing, the practice continued as before. This is, again, not unusual in the history of religion, where the gap between official teaching and lived practice is frequently wide enough to navigate a longship through. The third and perhaps most interesting source of the myth is the medieval church's complicated relationship with the body as a theological concept. Christian theology in the medieval period held the body in genuinely ambivalent regard. It was simultaneously the vessel of the divine image, the site of resurrection, and a source of temptation, weakness, and sin. This ambivalence generated a rich and sometimes contradictory body of thought about how the physical person should be treated, how much attention was appropriate to give to its comfort and appearance, and where the line fell between legitimate care and sinful indulgence. The concept of vainglory, the sin of excessive pride in one's appearance and the attention paid to it, was a genuine concern in medieval Christian ethics, and it shaped the way that cleanliness and grooming were discussed in moral literature. Too much attention to the body's appearance was spiritually dangerous. But too little was also problematic because neglect of the body could itself be a form of spiritual pride, the ostentatious holiness of the person who makes a show of not caring about physical things as a way of demonstrating their elevated spiritual focus. The correct position, as medieval moralists worked it out, was somewhere in the middle, sufficient attention to cleanliness and grooming to be presentable and healthy, without tipping over into the vanity of excessive self-adornment or the spiritual theater of deliberate neglect. This is actually a rather sophisticated ethical position, and it produced some genuinely interesting practical guidance. Bathing for health was good. Bathing for the legitimate purpose of being clean and presentable was acceptable. Bathing as a form of sensual indulgence, an end in itself pursued for the pleasure of the warm water and the perfumed oils, was spiritually questionable. And bathing in socially mixed, leisurely, wine-accompanied establishments that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the Roman baths that the Church Fathers had specifically criticized, that was where the moral commentary became most pointed, and where the Church's regulatory impulse most actively engaged. Here is the quirky detail that tends to surprise people in this context. The medieval Church maintained public bathhouses, directly, institutionally, as a matter of normal episcopal and monastic practice. Bishops endowed bathhouses. Monasteries operated bathhouses not just for their own communities but for the lay populations of their surrounding areas. The great monastic hospitals, institutions like the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, which has the distinction of being one of the oldest continuously operating hospitals in the world, maintained bathing facilities as a standard part of their medical provision. The Church was simultaneously issuing moral cautions about excessive bathing and actively building and operating the institutions in which that bathing took place, which is the kind of institutional contradiction that would be remarkable if it were not so entirely characteristic of large, complex organizations navigating between their ideals and their practical responsibilities. The picture that emerges from all of this, once you have cleared away the myth and looked at what was actually happening, is of a church that was genuinely ambivalent about the body, as its theology required it to be, but that never, in its mainstream institutional practice, endorsed or promoted bodily neglect as a spiritual virtue. The monasteries were clean. The hospitals bathed their patients. The cathedral schools taught medicine that included hydrotherapy. The bishops regulated the bathhouses rather than abolishing them. The confessors' manuals addressed the moral dimensions of bathing without concluding that bathing itself was sinful. You might even feel a small, retrospective sympathy for the medieval theologian trying to work all of this out. Sitting in a cold scriptorium, writing carefully about the spiritual dangers of warm water, aware that the monastery's bathing schedule is posted on the wall behind him and that he is himself scheduled for a bath on Saturday. The contradictions were real, and they were lived, and living with them required the kind of daily, practical wisdom that systematic theology sometimes struggles to provide. The Church did not tell medieval Europeans to be dirty. It told them, with considerable nuance and not always consistent clarity, to be clean in the right way, for the right reasons with the right attitude, which is, when you strip away the theological vocabulary, more or less what every other moral tradition has said about personal hygiene across human history. The monk finishes his bath. He dries himself with the linen the infirmarian has provided, dresses again in his habit, and returns to the cloister, where the bell is already ringing for the next office. His body is clean. His soul, he trusts, is moving in the right direction. The two concerns are not, in his experience of living them, as separate as the myth would have you believe. They are part of the same project, the daily, disciplined, imperfect work of being a human being trying to do things properly, in all the ways that properly requires. Outside the monastery walls, the city continues its own complicated relationship with cleanliness and the body, in ways that have rather less theological supervision and rather more practical ingenuity. The nobles are heating their bathwater with considerably more ceremony. The peasants are making do with considerably less of it. And both of these stories, with all their details, are waiting for us just ahead in the warm and fragrant darkness of tonight's continuing journey. The invitation arrives on a Tuesday, written on good vellum in a careful hand, and it informs you that you are expected at court this Friday for a banquet in honor of a visiting dignitary from the Duchy of Burgundy. You have 3 days. 3 days to arrange your travel, select your clothing, prepare your gift, and this is not a minor consideration, this is in fact one of the most significant logistical challenges the invitation presents. Ensure that you arrive smelling like someone who deserves to be in the same room as a king. Personal hygiene in the medieval aristocratic world was not merely a private matter of comfort and health. It was a political act. It was a social performance. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a form of communication, a signal sent through the medium of the body itself about one's status, one's resources, one's civilization, one's fitness to occupy the elevated position that birth or fortune had assigned. To arrive at a royal court dirty and malodorous was not simply a personal failing. It was a statement, whether intended or not, about the seriousness with which you took your obligations to the social hierarchy. And in a world where social hierarchy was understood as divinely ordained and its maintenance as a moral imperative, that was a statement with real consequences. So you have 3 days, and you are going to use them well because medieval aristocratic bathing culture was nothing if not thorough, and you have a reputation to maintain. The first thing to understand about noble bathing in the medieval period is that the bathing tub was itself a status object, an item of conspicuous material culture that announced, by its quality and its fittings, the wealth and sophistication of its owner. The wooden tubs used by ordinary households were functional objects, made to serve a purpose and not to impress. The bathing equipment of the aristocracy was something considerably more elaborate. Royal and high noble households possessed tubs that were works of craftsmanship, sometimes lined with fine linen or even silk, sometimes painted or carved, sometimes fitted with canopies of fabric that could be drawn around the bather to retain heat and create an enclosed, intimate space that was simultaneously practical and theatrical. The canopied bath, in particular, appears repeatedly in medieval illuminations of aristocratic life, and it has a quality of deliberate staging about it. The bather centered within the frame of the canopy like a figure in a painting, attended by servants, surrounded by the visual markers of luxury, performing the act of cleanliness as a kind of tableau. The water in an aristocratic bath was prepared with an attention to detail that would not embarrass a modern spa. Hot water, obviously, but hot water that had been infused with a carefully selected mixture of herbs and aromatic substances chosen for their specific properties, therapeutic, cosmetic, or simply olfactory. Rose petals for softness and fragrance. Lavender for its calming and antiseptic qualities. Chamomile for its soothing properties. Mint for its invigorating freshness. More expensive additions might include imported spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, whose scent was associated with wealth and exotic origin. Because in a world where spices traveled thousands of miles and cost extraordinary sums, smelling of them was a direct olfactory advertisement of your purchasing power. Historians still argue whether the aromatic additives in aristocratic baths were primarily understood in medical terms, as therapeutic substances acting on the body through the skin and breath, or primarily in social terms, as luxury signals distinguishing elite bathing from the plain hot water of lesser households. Almost certainly, the answer is both, and the medieval aristocratic mind would not have experienced these two functions as separate. The mainstream historical fact that anchors the aristocratic bathing story is both charming and slightly astonishing. Bathing together, specifically, a lord bathing with an honored guest, was a recognized form of diplomatic hospitality in medieval Europe. The shared bath was an act of trust and intimacy, an offer of closeness that communicated welcome and esteem in a way that the more formal ceremonies of courtly life did not always allow. Chronicles record occasions on which kings bathed with visiting nobles as a deliberate gesture of favor and friendship. The bath, in this context, was not merely hygienic. It was political. It was a tool of statecraft, deployed by rulers who understood that the performance of intimacy, carefully managed, symbolically loaded intimacy, was one of the most effective instruments of alliance building available to them. This diplomatic dimension of bathing reached its most elaborate expression in the rituals surrounding the bath of a newly made knight. The ceremonial bath that preceded the dubbing ceremony, giving us the phrase Knight of the Bath, which survives in the British honors system to this day, was a ritual of purification and symbolic transformation. The candidate for knighthood bathed on the eve of his ceremony, attended by his sponsors, in a bath that was understood to wash away his former, unknightly self and prepare him for the sacred obligations he was about to assume. The water was not just water. The bath was not just a bath. It was a rite of passage, structured and witnessed and invested with the full symbolic weight that a society organized around the concept of chivalric identity could bring to bear on a man sitting in a wooden tub. You soak in that image for a moment. The young man on the eve of his knighthood, sitting in the carefully prepared bath while his sponsors stand around him reciting the obligations of his new estate, the candlelight flickering on the water's surface, the herbs releasing their fragrance into the steam. It is simultaneously mundane and magnificent, which is very characteristic of the medieval aristocratic sensibility, its ability to take ordinary physical activities and load them with symbolic meaning until they become something close to sacred. The preparation of a noble bath required a small army of personnel, each with specific responsibilities in the elaborate choreography of elite hygiene. The lady of the bedchamber or the lord's personal attendants were responsible for the overall management of the process. Servants carried the water, enormous quantities of it, heated in the kitchens or over fires in the great hall and transported in buckets and cauldrons through however many corridors separated the heating source from the bathing location. Other servants prepared the herbal infusions, selected and measured the aromatic additives, ensured that the linen linings of the tub were clean and properly fitted. Still others prepared the post-bath experience, the warm towels, the drying cloths, the fresh garments laid out in the proper order, the food and drink that might be consumed during or after bathing. Because eating and drinking during the bath was an entirely acceptable and in fact quite fashionable thing to do in aristocratic circles. The bath as a setting for leisure extended, in noble households, to encompass dining. Small tables were set up adjacent to or even bridging the tub. Wine was poured, delicacies were served. The medieval aristocratic bath was, at its most elaborate, essentially a private dining experience conducted in warm water, which is either the height of decadent self-indulgence or a remarkably efficient use of leisure time, depending on your perspective, and frankly both assessments seem defensible. The grooming that accompanied and followed the aristocratic bath was equally elaborate. Hair was washed, dried, combed, and dressed with considerable care. Medieval aristocratic hair care involved a range of preparations including herbal rinses believed to add shine and fragrance, combs of ivory or fine wood, and the application of aromatic oils and pomades that kept the hair dressed and fragrant between washings. Beards, for those men who wore them, were combed and trimmed and sometimes anointed. Nails were cut and cleaned. Teeth were attended to with toothcloths and various abrasive preparations. The medieval toothbrush was typically a small piece of cloth wrapped around the finger, used with a paste or powder made from things like ground chalk, salt, or burnt rosemary, which is not exactly mint fresh but represents a genuine effort at dental hygiene rather than the complete indifference to it that the myth implies. The skin care that followed the medieval aristocratic bath is where the modern observer begins to feel the most immediate recognition. Face creams, hand creams, preparations for softening and lightening the skin. These were standard elements of aristocratic grooming culture, for both men and women, and the recipe literature that survives from the medieval period contains an extraordinary range of formulations for various cosmetic purposes. Some of these preparations were benign and probably effective: rose water as a gentle toner, almond oil as a moisturizer, various herbal preparations with genuine anti-inflammatory properties. Others were less fortunate in their ingredients, including preparations based on lead white that would whiten the skin very effectively while also slowly poisoning the person applying them, which is the kind of beauty cost-benefit calculation that we are perhaps fortunate to have moved beyond. The culture of aristocratic female beauty in medieval Europe deserves particular attention, because it is both more elaborate and more medically interesting than popular imagination suggests. Medieval women of high status had access to a substantial body of literature, in Latin and in the vernacular languages, addressing the care and beautification of the female body. The Trotula, a collection of texts on women's medicine compiled in southern Italy in the 12th century and circulated widely throughout the medieval period, contains detailed guidance on skin care, hair care, cosmetic preparation, and the management of various bodily concerns, all written with the practical matter-of-factness of a tradition that took the legitimate concerns of women's bodies seriously as a medical subject. Here is the quirky detail that tends to delight people when they encounter it in this context. The Trotula includes a recipe for a preparation intended to make a woman's private areas smell pleasant, made from a mixture of aromatic herbs and spices applied as a fumigation. the woman seated over a vessel of heated aromatic substances, allowing the fragrant steam to penetrate the relevant area. This is, in the language of modern wellness marketing, essentially a vaginal steam treatment, which has recently been enthusiastically promoted by various celebrity wellness brands as a revolutionary modern innovation. It was, in fact, a standard element of medieval aristocratic female hygiene as documented in 12th century medical literature. The medieval noblewomen got there first by approximately 800 years. Royal bathing deserves its own moment, because the bathing habits of medieval monarchs were documented with a thoroughness that lower social strata simply did not attract. We know, for instance, that the court of medieval England maintained specific royal bathing arrangements that traveled with the king, portable tubs, bathing equipment, the servants responsible for managing it, all forming part of the enormous logistical train of the itinerant medieval court. We know that bathing was considered sufficiently important in royal households that specific officers were sometimes appointed to oversee it. We know that the bathwater of a monarch, like many things associated with the royal person, could carry symbolic weight. The blessing of the royal touch was considered to have healing properties, and the water that had touched a sacred royal body was not something to be treated casually. Queen Isabella of Bavaria, consort of the troubled French king Charles VI, reportedly spent considerable sums on her bathing arrangements, including purchases of perfumed substances, aromatic additives, and the various preparations that made her bath something closer to an olfactory experience than a merely hygienic one. The English royal household accounts, which survive in remarkable detail for certain periods, include regular entries for the purchase of soap, bathing linen, and the various materials associated with royal grooming. These are not the accounts of a court indifferent to cleanliness. They are the accounts of an institution that treated the presentation of the royal body as a matter of state importance and invested accordingly. The feast you are attending on Friday is getting closer, and you are beginning to feel cautiously confident that you will arrive in a condition appropriate to the occasion. Your bath is prepared, the water heated, the herbs selected, the linen fresh. Your attendant is waiting with the drying cloths and the clean garments. The wine is on the small table beside the tub, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible through the thick walls of the manor house, someone is playing something slow and rather beautiful on a stringed instrument. You lower yourself into the water, feel the heat spread through your muscles, breathe in the mingled fragrance of lavender and rose and something faintly spiced that you cannot quite identify but that smells like wealth and competence and the confident assurance that you belong exactly where you are going. The steam rises, the candlelight softens, and you remember distantly that outside these comfortable walls, down through the village, out past the fields, in the cottages and the farms and the working landscape of the medieval world, other people are managing this same basic human requirement of cleanliness with considerably different resources and considerably different results, but with a practical ingenuity and a dignity of their own that deserves its own telling. That telling is next. The water is cooling slightly. It is time to get out, get dressed, and descend from the aristocratic heights into the rich, resourceful, surprisingly dignified world of medieval common life. You wake before the sun, which is not a choice so much as a biological fact of life when you live in a medieval village and your internal clock has been calibrated by years of sleeping when it is dark and rising when it is not. The mattress beneath you, stuffed with straw, which rustles when you move and has developed a particular compression in the shape of your body over the years of its use, is not uncomfortable exactly, but it is also not the kind of surface that encourages extended lounging. There is work to be done. There is always work to be done. The list of things requiring your attention before the morning is half over would exhaust a modern person before they had finished reading it, and the question of personal hygiene sits somewhere in the middle of that list. Not at the top, where survival concerns like feeding the animals and checking the weather live, but firmly present, because the idea that medieval peasants did not care about being clean is, as we have been establishing all evening, a myth. And it is a myth that the actual evidence of medieval common life dismantles with considerable thoroughness. The common person's relationship with cleanliness in medieval Europe is the part of this story that is most frequently either ignored or caricatured, because it is also the part about which the documentary evidence is thinnest and most indirect. The people at the bottom of the medieval social hierarchy, the villeins and serfs, the free peasants and tenant farmers, the urban workers and rural laborers who made up the vast majority of the medieval European population, did not, in general, write about their bathing habits. They did not commission illuminated manuscripts showing themselves in their tubs. They did not leave household account books recording purchases of aromatic bath additives. The written record, as we noted early in our journey tonight, skews relentlessly toward the literate and the wealthy, which means that recovering the bathing lives of ordinary medieval people requires a different kind of historical detective work. Reading between the lines of sources that mention the common people only incidentally, examining the material evidence that archaeology provides, and drawing careful inferences from the practical realities of medieval rural and urban life. What that detective work reveals is not a picture of universal squalor. It is a picture of practical, resourceful, context-dependent cleanliness, hygiene practices shaped by the genuine constraints of limited resources, demanding physical labor, and restricted access to the institutional infrastructure that made elite bathing so elaborate, but practices that were nonetheless real, regular, and embedded in the rhythms of daily and seasonal life with a matter-of-factness that speaks to deep cultural expectation rather than occasional reluctant concession. The most basic and most universal form of cleanliness available to the medieval common person was the wash, a targeted, partial cleaning of the face, hands, and neck using water from whatever source was most immediately available. A stream, a well, a rain barrel, a bucket drawn and kept near the door. This was not the full immersion bath of the aristocratic tradition, and it was not meant to be. It was the daily maintenance wash, the minimum baseline that kept a person functional and socially presentable, and it was performed by virtually everyone in medieval Europe regardless of social station, because the expectation of at least this level of cleanliness was, as the courtesy literature makes abundantly clear, essentially universal. The hands, as we noted in our opening section, remember that early emphasis on hand-washing before meals were the most consistently and frequently cleaned part of the medieval common person's body, and for good practical reason. Hands that have been working in fields, tending animals, processing food, building things, carrying things, and doing all the other manual work that medieval rural life demanded are hands that accumulate significant quantities of agricultural reality. And eating with those hands without washing them first is an experience that even the most robust medieval digestive system preferred to avoid. The hand-washing basin, sometimes a simple wooden bowl, sometimes a ceramic vessel kept near the eating area, was a fixture of even the most modest medieval household, and its use was regular enough to be taken entirely for granted in the sources that mention it. Beyond the daily wash, the medieval peasant's more thorough bathing was shaped by the seasonal and weekly rhythms of rural life in ways that were practical rather than negligent. The Saturday bath, a wash more thorough than the daily face and hands routine, performed in preparation for Sunday worship, was a sufficiently widespread cultural practice to appear repeatedly in the sources, both as an expected norm and, occasionally, as something people are reminded to do when the reminder seems necessary, which is itself evidence that the expectation existed and was considered worth enforcing. Going to church clean was understood as a basic obligation of Christian social life, and the Saturday bath was the mechanism by which that obligation was fulfilled in a world without running water. The infrastructure for this bath varied enormously depending on circumstance. In a household with sufficient resources, a cauldron, access to fuel, and the time to heat water, a proper wooden tub bath was achievable, and the practice of sequential family bathing in shared heated water that we mentioned earlier was the common mechanism. The water was heated once, the family bathed in order of precedence, typically the adults before the children, though the specific order varied by household and custom, and the water was used until it was either too cold or too dirty to be useful, at which point it was disposed of and the exercise was complete. This happened weekly in reasonably prosperous rural households, perhaps less frequently in poorer ones or during the most demanding seasons of the agricultural year, when the time and fuel required for bath preparation genuinely competed with more urgent claims on both. The mainstream historical fact that most effectively challenges the peasant filth narrative is the extensive evidence for communal bathing facilities in medieval rural communities. Bathing infrastructure was not exclusively an urban phenomenon. Many medieval villages maintained communal heating arrangements, shared ovens, shared laundry facilities, and in some regions shared bathing arrangements that made the resources for washing available to households that could not easily provide them individually. In Scandinavia and the Baltic regions, the communal sauna served this function explicitly and with great thoroughness. The village sauna was a shared resource, maintained communally, available for regular use, and central enough to community life that its upkeep was a recognized collective responsibility. In German-speaking regions, the village bathhouse performed a similar function in many communities, bringing the bathhouse culture of the city into the rural context at a scale appropriate to smaller populations and more limited resources. Here is where the story of peasant bathing gets genuinely interesting from a social history perspective, because the communal bathing space in a rural medieval community was not just a hygiene facility. It was a social institution in the same way that the urban bathhouse was a social institution. A place where community happened, where news was exchanged, where relationships were maintained and negotiated, where the shared experience of cleanliness created and reinforced the bonds of collective life. The Scandinavian sauna tradition, which survives with remarkable continuity into the present day, preserves something of this social function in ways that give us a direct experiential window into what communal medieval bathing probably felt like. The combination of physical relief and social ease, the particular quality of conversation that happens in hot, steam-filled spaces among people who are simultaneously vulnerable and comfortable, the sense of community that shared physical experience generates. The laundry, it is worth noting, was itself a form of bathing culture, or at least a form of hygiene culture that overlapped significantly with it. The medieval laundry process was demanding, time-consuming, and physically strenuous, involving the soaking, beating, wringing, and drying of textiles that had absorbed weeks of accumulated bodily reality, and it was performed communally in many communities at shared water sources, streams, rivers, ponds, communal laundry areas that served as social gathering spaces in exactly the same way as the bathhouse. The women who gathered at the laundry stream were not merely washing clothes. They were maintaining the broader textile hygiene of their households, keeping the linen and wool that was in daily contact with bodies clean in a way that supplemented and extended the effects of the body washing they also performed. Medieval garment hygiene deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular discussions of medieval cleanliness, because it was, in practice, one of the most important mechanisms by which medieval people of all social classes managed bodily hygiene. The linen undergarment, the shirt or chemise worn directly against the skin, functioned as a kind of wicking layer, absorbing sweat and bodily oils and transferring them away from the skin, and this underlinen was washed far more frequently than the outer garments worn over it. A medieval peasant who bathed weekly but changed and washed their underlinen every few days was maintaining a level of actual skin cleanliness that is considerably closer to modern standards than the superficial picture of infrequent bathing might suggest. Historians still argue whether the medieval emphasis on clean underlinen was a conscious hygienic strategy, a deliberate response to the practical difficulties of full-body washing, or simply a cultural norm whose hygienic effects were a happy accident of practices organized around other concerns, such as the social presentation of clean, visible clothing. The answer probably varies by individual and by period, but the hygienic effect was real regardless of the intention behind it. The water sources available to medieval common people were varied and their quality was, by modern standards, often questionable, which is one of the genuine difficulties that the peasant bather faced that their aristocratic counterparts could more easily manage around. A running stream is considerably cleaner than a stagnant pond, but considerably less clean than water that has been filtered, settled, and drawn from a good deep well. Urban water supplies, where they existed, ranged from the reasonably reliable to the actively dangerous, depending on how close the water source was to the various other things that medieval urban life poured into its waterways. The medieval city's relationship with its water supply was, to put it politely, complicated, and we will return to this theme when we reach the section on disease and the great fear of water that the plague years generated. For now, though, the rural water supply, while imperfect, was generally sufficient for the purposes of washing, and the medieval peasant used it with the practical efficiency that characterized their approach to all scarce resources. You did not waste water. You did not heat more than you needed. You did not draw from the stream when the well was closer. You organized your washing around the other water-intensive activities of household management, laundry, food preparation, animal care, so that trips to the water source served multiple purposes simultaneously. This was not the slovenly indifference to cleanliness of popular myth. This was the careful, intelligent resource management of people operating under genuine constraints with genuine competence. The quirky detail that illuminates the peasant bathing world from an unexpected angle comes from the folklore and popular custom of the medieval period, which preserves evidence of bathing rituals attached to the agricultural calendar in ways that suggest bathing was embedded not just in weekly routine but in the deeper rhythms of the seasonal year. Midsummer bathing customs, in which communal bathing in rivers or lakes was associated with the summer solstice celebrations, appear across northern and central Europe with enough consistency to suggest a genuine pan-regional tradition, probably pre-Christian in origin, absorbed into the Christian calendar as many pre-Christian seasonal practices were, and associated with ideas of purification, health, and the renewal of physical vitality that the warm season represented after the cold endurance of winter. These seasonal bathing customs are worth noting because they reveal something important about the psychology of medieval cleanliness at the common level. Bathing was not merely a practical response to the accumulation of dirt. It was a meaningful act, connected to ideas about renewal, purification, health, and the proper relationship between the human body and the natural world. The person who waded into a midsummer river was not just getting clean. They were participating in something, a cultural practice that placed their individual body within a larger framework of seasonal and communal meaning. That is not the behavior of people indifferent to cleanliness. That is the behavior of people who have found ways to make cleanliness meaningful, which is what human beings tend to do with things they consider important. As the morning light begins to strengthen over the medieval village, you have finished your wash, face and hands in the water from the barrel near the door, brisk and cold and entirely adequate for the beginning of a working day, and you are pulling on your underlinen, which was washed 3 days ago and still smells of the herbs that were added to the laundry water. You are clean in the way that medieval common life defined clean, functionally, practically, sufficiently. You are not perfumed with imported spices. You are not soaking in a canopied tub while a musician plays in the corner. But you are, by the standards of your time and place and circumstance, entirely presentable, and you would be quietly offended by the suggestion that you were anything else. The day is beginning. The work is endless. But you are clean, and that matters because it has always mattered to people in every circumstance in every century. The basic human dignity of a body that has been attended to, cared for, washed. That dignity does not belong only to the aristocracy. It never did. And as you step out into the morning, the medieval village waking around you, that quiet, practical, entirely human dignity goes with you into everything the day requires. Something is changing in the air, though. Something that you cannot quite name yet, but that you can feel at the edges of the morning. A shift in how people talk about water, about bodies, about the relationship between cleanliness and safety. The great fear is coming. And when it arrives, it will change everything. The year is 1348, and the news arrives in your city the way all terrible news arrives in the medieval world. Gradually, then all at once. First it is a rumor, the kind that travelers bring with them like unwanted luggage, stories of something happening in distant places, in Italian port cities, in French trading towns, in places connected to yours by the invisible threads of commerce and pilgrimage and the constant movement of medieval life. Then the rumor becomes a report, more specific, more insistent, carried by people whose faces tell you something that their words are still trying to soften. Then the reports become undeniable because the thing itself has arrived, and the city is no longer receiving news about the plague. The city is the news about the plague, and everything changes. The Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351 in its first and most devastating wave, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population, numbers so large that they resist genuine comprehension, that the mind keeps trying to reduce to something manageable and keeps failing. In some regions and some cities, the mortality was significantly higher than the continental average. In some communities, entire populations were effectively eliminated. The social, economic, psychological, and cultural consequences of this catastrophe were so profound and so pervasive that they reshaped European civilization in ways that are still visible today, 8 centuries later, if you know where to look. And one of the places where the consequences were most dramatic, most lasting, and most relevant to our story tonight was in the relationship between European civilization and water. Because the Black Death did not just kill people. It killed an idea, or at least severely wounded one, and the idea it wounded was the idea that bathing was safe. To understand how this happened, you need to understand the medical framework through which medieval people interpreted disease, because it was genuinely different from our own in ways that made the connection between bathing and danger seem not just plausible but rigorously logical. Medieval medicine operated primarily within the framework of humoral theory, the inherited classical idea, ultimately derived from Hippocratic and Galenic sources, that health was a matter of balance among four bodily humors, and that disease was the result of those humors falling out of their proper proportion. The humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and they were associated with the four elements, the four seasons, the four qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry, and an elaborate system of correspondences that made medieval medicine feel, from the inside, like a coherent and comprehensive explanatory framework. Within this framework, the skin was understood as a permeable membrane, a boundary between the body's interior and the external world that was not fixed and impermeable but actively porous, capable of admitting external substances into the body and releasing internal humoral imbalances outward. This was the theoretical basis for the therapeutic bath, the belief that beneficial substances dissolved in bath water could be absorbed through the open pores of the skin, delivering their properties directly into the body's humoral economy. Hot water opened the pores. Herbs dissolved in the water passed through those open pores into the body. The bath was medicine delivered through the skin. You can already see where this is going. If hot water opens the pores and allows beneficial substances to enter the body, then hot water also opens the pores and allows harmful substances to enter the body. And if the plague, whose actual mechanism of transmission through the bacterium Yersinia pestis was entirely unknown and would remain unknown for another 5 centuries, was understood as a form of atmospheric corruption, a miasma of diseased air and diseased matter emanating from the earth and the bodies of the sick, then bathing in hot water during a plague epidemic was, within the logic of medieval medical theory, a genuinely dangerous thing to do. This is the mainstream historical fact that anchors this section of our story. The medical condemnation of bathing during plague conditions was not ignorance or superstition in the crude sense. It was a logical deduction from a coherent theoretical framework. Wrong in its premises, as we now know, but internally consistent and applied with genuine medical seriousness by physicians who were doing their best to understand and combat a catastrophe that was killing everyone around them, including their colleagues and their patients, faster than anything they had previously encountered. The physicians who advised against bathing during the plague were not abandoning medicine. They were practicing it according to the best theoretical tools available to them. The miasma theory, the idea that disease was transmitted through corrupted air rather than through specific pathogenic organisms, was the dominant medical explanation for epidemic disease throughout the medieval period and well into the early modern era. It was not a fringe idea. It was mainstream, authoritative, endorsed by the most respected medical institutions and the most learned physicians of the era. And it led, with terrible logical consistency, to a set of conclusions about bathing that reversed centuries of positive medical attitude toward hydrotherapy and replaced them with a new and genuinely frightening association between water and death. If miasma was the mechanism of plague transmission, then anything that opened the body to the corrupted air was dangerous. Hot baths opened the pores. Steam baths opened the pores even more dramatically. The bathhouse, with its hot, humid, enclosed atmosphere, an atmosphere that was already, in miasmatic terms, a concentration of exactly the kind of warm, damp, corrupted air that disease was thought to thrive in, became, in the medical imagination of the plague years and after, place of genuine danger. Not moral danger, as the church critics had sometimes suggested. Medical danger, the kind that killed you. The practical response was significant and rapid. Public bathhouses across Europe saw dramatic declines in attendance during the plague years, which is entirely understandable, since the bathhouse was also a place where large numbers of sick and healthy people came into close contact, and even without any theoretical framework, basic observation would have suggested that this was not ideal during an epidemic. But the theoretical framework amplified the practical response and gave it a durability that outlasted the immediate crisis. When the first wave of plague subsided, the bathhouses did not simply reopen to their former levels of patronage. The fear remained, the medical advice remained, and a practice that had been socially normal and medically endorsed for centuries found itself recast, in the medical literature of the post-plague generation, as a source of danger rather than a source of health. Historians still argue whether the decline of public bathing in late medieval and early modern Europe was primarily caused by the medical response to plague, or whether it was driven by a combination of factors: moral concerns about the bathhouse's dual reputation, economic disruption from the plague's demographic devastation, the shift in medical theory toward dry cleansing methods, and the increasing association of nudity and mixed bathing with social disorder that converged in the late medieval period to make the public bathhouse untenable in ways that went beyond any single cause. The medical argument was clearly significant, but it probably did not act alone, and the relative weight of these different factors is a question that continues to generate productive scholarly disagreement. Here is the quirky detail that illuminates this historical shift from an unexpected angle. The same medical logic that condemned bathing as dangerous during the plague simultaneously promoted an alternative hygiene practice that strikes modern observers as considerably less hygienic: the use of linen to clean the body by rubbing and absorbing rather than washing with water. The dry or semi-dry cleaning of the body with clean linen cloths was proposed by late medieval physicians as a safer alternative to water-based washing, on the grounds that it cleaned the skin surface without opening the pores to atmospheric corruption. If you regularly changed your underlinen, if you wore clean linen against your skin and changed it frequently, you were, in the medical theory of the era, maintaining adequate bodily cleanliness without the dangerous porosity that hot water bathing introduced. This sounds almost comical from a modern perspective, replacing washing with rubbing yourself with cloth, but it was not entirely without practical merit. Clean linen against the skin does absorb moisture and reduce bacterial growth on the skin surface. Regular changing of underlinen does reduce the accumulation of bodily grime in a meaningful way. It was not equivalent to washing, but it was not nothing, and within the theoretical framework that generated it, it was a coherent and genuinely motivated hygienic practice rather than a rationalization of laziness. The shift toward dry cleansing also had economic and social dimensions that interacted with the medical argument in complicated ways. Linen production was a significant medieval industry, and the availability of linen, its cost, its quality, its accessibility to different social classes, shaped who could practice the linen-based cleanliness ideal and how effectively. The wealthy could afford abundant clean linen, frequently changed. The poor could not, which meant that the shift away from water-based public bathing hit the lower social classes particularly hard, because the water-based public bathhouse had been democratically accessible in a way that abundant personal linen was not. The bathhouse, for all its complications, had been a leveler. Clean linen as a hygiene strategy was considerably less democratic. The atmosphere of the post-plague city, and we should pause to appreciate how genuinely traumatic the plague experience was for the survivors, how comprehensively it disrupted every aspect of social and psychological life, was one in which the relationship with the physical environment had been fundamentally destabilized. The air, the water, the soil, the bodies of other people, all of these had been revealed, in the most brutal possible way, as potential sources of lethal danger. The openness and sociability of the medieval bathhouse culture, its cheerful mixing of bodies in warm communal water, its assumption that shared physical space was a pleasure rather than a threat, all of this now carried a shadow of fear that it had not carried before. The social psychology of this shift is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the most significant and least discussed consequences of the Black Death in popular historical accounts. Societies that experience catastrophic epidemic disease tend to develop persistent, culturally embedded anxieties about contamination and bodily boundaries that outlast the specific epidemic and shape behavior for generations afterward. The medieval response to plague was not simply a temporary adjustment that ended when the epidemic subsided. It was a recalibration of the relationship between the body and the world, a new wariness about the porousness of the self, about what could get in through the skin, about the safety of shared water and shared air and shared space. This recalibration expressed itself in multiple ways in the century and a half following the first plague wave. In medical literature, the shift toward dry cleansing and away from therapeutic bathing became more pronounced. In urban regulation, the bathhouse came under increasing scrutiny, for its potential as a site of disease transmission, for its moral ambiguities, for its crowding and its heat, and it's exactly the kind of warm, damp, enclosed atmosphere that miasma theory identified as dangerous. In popular culture, water acquired associations of danger and impurity that it had not previously carried with anything like the same intensity. The irony, and it is a painful one worth acknowledging directly, is that the medical advice generated by the miasmatic framework, however logical within its own terms, moved European hygiene practice in exactly the wrong direction from the perspective of actual disease prevention. Plague is transmitted primarily by fleas and the bacteria they carry, and by respiratory droplets from infected individuals. It is not transmitted through bathing. Clean water is not a vector for Yersinia pestis. The people who continued to bathe were not, by bathing, making themselves more vulnerable to plague. They were, if anything, reducing the flea populations on their bodies and their linen, which would have had a small but genuine protective effect. But they did not know this. They could not have known this without the germ theory of disease that would not arrive for another 5 centuries and the microscopy that would not exist for several more decades beyond that. They were working with the knowledge they had, in the most frightening conditions imaginable, trying to protect themselves and their communities from a killer they could not see and did not understand. The fact that their best available theory led them in the wrong direction is a tragedy of knowledge rather than a failure of intelligence, and it deserves to be understood as such. As the plague years recede into memory, not gone, never entirely gone, returning in subsequent waves throughout the late medieval and early modern period, each wave reinforcing the fear and the avoidance, the medieval bathing culture that we have been exploring tonight begins its long, slow, uneven retreat. The bathhouses are not all closed immediately. The habit is not abandoned overnight. But the trajectory is clear, and it is downward, and the world that emerges on the other side of the plague years will have a relationship with water and bathing and the public bath that is measurably more anxious, more cautious, and more complicated than the world that entered them. There is a kind of grief in watching this happen, knowing what we know, knowing that the fear was misdirected, that the remedy was counterproductive, that a rich and genuinely admirable culture of communal cleanliness was dismantled partly on the basis of a theory that was wrong in exactly the ways that mattered most. But grief is perhaps not quite the right response, because the people who lived through this were not making choices carelessly. They were making the best choices available to them in the dark, which is what human beings have always done and will always do, and which is, in its own way, something close to heroic. The steam is thinning now. The bathhouses are quieter. And in the market, a different kind of trade is flourishing, the trade in soap, in herbs, in the materials of a domestic, private, water-cautious cleanliness that is beginning to replace the communal, institutional cleanliness that came before it. We should go and look at what they are selling, because the chemistry of medieval clean is more interesting than you might expect, and the people who made and traded in soap were doing something genuinely remarkable with the resources they had. The soap maker rises early, which is a practical necessity rather than a personal virtue, because the process of making soap, real soap, the kind that actually cleans, the kind that has taken centuries of accumulated practical knowledge to perfect, requires a full day's work at minimum and considerably more if you are doing it properly. And the fire needs to be lit, and the lye needs to be leaching, and the fats need to be rendering before the morning is properly underway if you want to have anything useful to show for your efforts by evening. The workshop smells extraordinary, in the specific sense that the smell is powerful enough to be extraordinary without being entirely pleasant. A combination of wood ash and animal fat and the sharp, almost aggressive alkalinity of the lye solution that sits in its wooden vessel near the door, doing its slow, patient, chemically inevitable work of becoming one of the most useful substances in the medieval world. You are in a soap maker's workshop in, let us say, Marseille sometime in the 12th century, and you are about to learn something that the popular mythology of medieval hygiene consistently fails to account for. Soap was not a medieval invention, but its widespread commercial production and trade was very much a medieval achievement, and the medieval soap industry, centered particularly in the Mediterranean cities that had access to olive oil, the essential ingredient of quality soap, was a genuine and significant economic enterprise that supplied cleansing products to households across Europe in quantities that would be impossible to reconcile with a civilization indifferent to personal hygiene. Let us begin with the chemistry, because the chemistry is genuinely elegant and understanding it changes the way you see everything else. Soap, at its most fundamental, is the product of a reaction between a fat and an alkali, what chemists now call saponification, a word derived from the Latin sapo, meaning soap, which gives you a sense of how ancient the Romans understood this reaction to be. The fat contributes the long carbon chains that form the structural backbone of the soap molecule. The alkali, in the medieval world, almost universally derived from wood ash leached in water to produce a lye solution, contributes the reactive element that breaks the fat molecules apart and reassembles them into something new. The result is a molecule with a split personality. One end is attracted to water, the other end is attracted to oil and grease. This split personality is what makes soap work. It grabs the grease and oil that ordinary water cannot dissolve, surrounds them in tiny molecular clusters, and allows the water to carry them away. It is, when you think about it, a remarkable piece of natural chemistry, and the people who discovered it, thousands of years before anyone understood the molecular mechanism, discovered it entirely by empirical observation, by noticing that ash and fat combined in the right way produced something useful, and by refining that observation over generations into a practical craft. The mainstream historical fact that reframes the whole picture here is this. By the 12th century, commercial soap production was a well-established industry in several Mediterranean cities, with Marseille, Genoa, Venice, and the Castilian city of Alicante among the most important centers. Marseille soap, made with local olive oil and the alkaline ash of marine plants, following a recipe that has been refined over centuries and that survives in a form still recognizable today as the famous Savon de Marseille, was being traded across the Mediterranean and northward into the markets of France, England, and the German territories from at least the 12th century onward. This was not a cottage industry producing soap for local use. This was commercial manufacturing and long-distance trade, organized through the same merchant networks that carried spices and silks and other high-value goods across medieval Europe, and supplying a commodity that people wanted in sufficient quantities to make the trade economically worthwhile. The quality of medieval soap varied enormously depending on the raw materials available and the skill of the maker. At the high end, Castile soap, made with pure olive oil and the potash derived from the ash of Barilla plants, a type of coastal succulent with particularly alkaline ash, was a genuine luxury product, hard, white, mild, and effective, prized for its gentleness on the skin and its clean, neutral scent. This was the soap that appeared in aristocratic households, that was purchased in quantities sufficient for regular use, that was sometimes scented with aromatic additions to make it more pleasant and more prestigious. At the lower end of the quality spectrum, soap made with animal fat, tallow from cattle or sheep, rather than olive oil, was coarser, softer, more strongly scented, and less gentle on the skin, but it was considerably cheaper and considerably more available in the northern European regions where olive oil was an expensive import rather than a local product. Between these extremes lay a considerable range of regional soap traditions, each shaped by the local availability of fats and alkalis and by the accumulated craft knowledge of local soap makers. In Northern Europe, where the tallow soap tradition dominated, innovations in ash chemistry, different woods producing ashes with different alkaline properties, different leaching methods producing lye of different strengths, produced a range of soap qualities that made the difference between a product that cleaned effectively and one that merely smeared itself across your skin in an unconvincing way. Getting the lye concentration right was the central technical challenge of soap making, and medieval soap makers addressed it through generations of empirical refinement, using tests like the float of a raw egg in the lye solution. If the egg floated at the right height, the lye was the right concentration, that were passed down through guild traditions with the seriousness of trade secrets. The Soap Makers Guild, where it existed, was one of the institutional mechanisms by which this accumulated knowledge was preserved and transmitted. In cities with significant soap production, the guild regulated quality standards, protected trade secrets, controlled access to the craft, and maintained the economic interests of its members with the same combination of genuine professional pride and naked self-interest that characterized medieval guild culture generally. The soap maker was not a marginal figure in the medieval urban economy. He, and occasionally she, since soap making had a domestic tradition alongside its commercial one, was a skilled craftsperson practicing a trade that required genuine chemical knowledge, even if that knowledge was entirely empirical and entirely untheorized in the modern sense. The herbal dimension of medieval cleansing culture deserves its own extended moment, because it is where the soap and bathing traditions intersect most productively with the broader medieval pharmacopoeia, the accumulated knowledge of plant properties that medieval medicine had inherited from classical sources, augmented through centuries of monastic cultivation and practical experience, and organized into a remarkably sophisticated system of botanical knowledge. Medieval herbal preparations for washing and grooming ranged from the simple to the genuinely elaborate, and the recipe literature that survives in household manuals, medical texts, and the specific genre of beauty and grooming guides that circulated in Latin and the vernacular from the 12th century onward, gives us an extraordinarily detailed picture of what people put on their bodies and why they believed it would help. Rosemary was among the most versatile. Boiled in water and used as a hair rinse, it was believed to strengthen the hair and darken it over time, to improve the memory through its scent, and to leave the scalp in better condition than it would otherwise be in. Chamomile water brightened fair hair and soothed irritated skin. Elderflower water was a classic preparation for the complexion. Medieval women of means used it regularly as a toner, applied with cloths to the face after washing, believed to reduce redness and improve the skin's clarity and texture. The preparation of these herbal washes was itself a skilled domestic art, practiced particularly by the women of noble and merchant households who were responsible for the health and grooming of their families and who maintained their own recipe books, sometimes inherited across generations, that recorded the preparations they had found most effective. These recipe books are among the most intimate and revealing documents that medieval domestic life has left us, because they record not just formulas but the accumulated empirical wisdom of women who had actually tested these preparations, who had modified them based on results, who had added notes in the margins about when a particular preparation worked better and when it was less effective. They are, in a sense, the earliest cosmetic research notebooks, evidence of a tradition of practical experimentation with personal care products that was conducted entirely outside the formal structures of medical education but that produced genuine, tested, refined knowledge. Here is the quirky detail that brings the medieval herbal cleansing tradition into unexpected relief. The recipe literature of the period includes preparations that were specifically designed to address body odor, not as a byproduct of general cleanliness, but as a targeted concern in its own right. Preparations to make the armpits smell pleasant, to sweeten the breath, to improve the smell of the feet. These appear with enough regularity in medieval recipe books to confirm that the medieval person was not only aware of body odor as a social problem but actively and practically engaged in addressing it. Herbal foot baths containing wormwood and mint. Armpit preparations involving rose water and aromatic resins. Breath-freshening preparations made from fennel seed, anise, and various aromatic spices chewed or steeped in wine and used as a mouthwash. The medieval grooming tradition was attending to exactly the same concerns that the modern personal care industry addresses. It was using different ingredients and different theoretical frameworks, but it was responding to the same human social imperative: the desire to smell like someone that other people want to be near. The trade networks that supplied the medieval soap and cosmetics industry were themselves a remarkable phenomenon, global in their reach long before the modern era of global commerce, connecting the craft workshops of European cities to the spice markets of the Middle East, the aloe plantations of North Africa, the aromatic forests of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the extensive herb gardens of European monasteries and noble estates. A soap maker in 13th century London might be working with olive oil from Andalusia, aromatic resins from the Levant, and colorants from sources scattered across the known world, all of it arriving through the medieval trading system that was simultaneously one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the pre-modern world and one of the most important mechanisms by which medical and cosmetic knowledge was transmitted across cultural boundaries. The Arabic contribution to medieval European cleansing culture is particularly significant and particularly under-acknowledged in popular accounts. The sophisticated soap-making and cosmetic traditions of the medieval Islamic world, which had preserved, extended, and significantly improved upon the classical Greco-Roman pharmacopoeia, entered European practice through multiple channels, through the translations of Arabic medical texts that transformed European medicine from the 12th century onward, through the commercial contacts of Mediterranean trade, through the direct cultural exchange of the Crusades and the interaction between Christian and Islamic civilization in Spain and Sicily. The aromatic soaps, the sophisticated cosmetic preparations, the refined hair care traditions. These were areas in which Islamic civilization in the medieval period was considerably more advanced than its European counterpart, and the transmission of that knowledge westward was one of the more significant, if less celebrated, cultural transfers of the medieval era. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms and timing of this transfer, whether specific soap-making techniques arrived in Europe through commercial contact with Islamic traders, through the reading of translated Arabic medical texts, or through the practical experience of crusaders and merchants who had spent time in Islamic cities and returned with new ideas about personal care alongside their other souvenirs. The evidence supports all three mechanisms to some degree, which suggests that the transfer was multiple and redundant rather than dependent on any single channel, the kind of cultural transmission that happens when two sophisticated civilizations with significant overlap in their concerns come into sustained contact across multiple interfaces simultaneously. The soap itself was not the only cleansing technology available in the medieval world, and it is worth pausing to note the other preparations that supplemented it in the medieval cleansing toolkit. Fuller's earth, a naturally occurring absorbent clay mineral, was used for cleaning both textiles and skin, particularly in the process of finishing wool cloth, but also as a dry cleanser applied to the skin and hair to absorb oils and remove surface grime without water. Sand and fine gravel were used as abrasives for scrubbing, not pleasant, exactly, but effective. Various plant ashes, applied directly rather than processed into lye, served as mild alkaline cleansers. The range of cleansing materials available to the medieval person was, in other words, considerably broader than the simple soap-or-nothing binary that popular accounts sometimes imply. The soap trade and the grooming culture it supplied were, as we have noted, beginning to shift in significance and character as the plague years receded and the late medieval period drew toward its close. The public bathhouse, once the primary institutional context in which soap and aromatic preparations were consumed, was declining. The domestic context was becoming more important: the private bath, the home preparation, the individual purchase of soap and herbs and cosmetic materials for use within the household rather than in a shared public space. This privatization of cleansing culture, which accelerates through the late medieval period and into the early modern era, has consequences for social equality that we have already touched on, the democratic bathhouse being replaced by private provision that is inevitably more stratified by wealth, and consequences for the soap trade itself, which must adapt its products and its marketing to a consumer who is washing at home rather than in a professional establishment. The soap maker in Marseille, working in the early morning light with his lye and his fat and his generations of accumulated craft knowledge, is part of a tradition that will outlast the medieval period by centuries. The savon de Marseille still exists, still made by variations of the same basic process, still recognizable as the product of the tradition he is practicing. That continuity is its own kind of testimony to the quality of what medieval soap makers figured out, that the basic chemistry of saponification, discovered and refined empirically across generations of craft practice, was good enough to last. It did not need to wait for modern chemistry to improve it. It was already, in its medieval form, remarkably effective. As you breathe in the imaginary smell of the soap maker's workshop, the wood ash and the fat and the sharp alkalinity of the lye, undercut by something warmer and more pleasant that you cannot quite identify, perhaps the slight sweetness of olive oil beginning to change into something else, you are breathing in one of the genuine achievements of medieval material culture. The people who figured out how to make good soap, who traded it across continents, who incorporated it into a rich tradition of herbal and cosmetic preparation, who wrote it into their recipe books and their guild regulations and their household manuals, these people were not stumbling in the dark. They were doing chemistry without knowing they were doing chemistry, and they were doing it rather well. The workshop is warming as the morning progresses. The soap is beginning to take shape in its wooden molds. And outside, the medieval world is moving toward its end. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way all endings happen, through the accumulation of small changes that only become visible as large ones when you step back far enough to see the whole arc. The bathing culture we have been exploring tonight is fading, slowly and unevenly, into something different. The last section of our story is the story of that fading, and of what, in fading, it left behind. There is a particular kind of melancholy that attaches itself to the end of things. Not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the softer, more diffuse sadness of watching something fade gradually, of noticing one day that what was once everywhere is now somewhere, and then someday soon will be nowhere, and of understanding that the people living through the fading rarely recognize it as such because the change is too slow, too incremental, too thoroughly woven into the fabric of ordinary life to announce itself as the historical rupture it actually is. The medieval bathing culture that we have been tracing together through this long, warm, quietly astonishing journey did not end on a particular day or in a particular year. It did not receive an obituary. It simply became, by degrees so gradual as to be almost imperceptible from inside the experience, less central, less institutional, less communal, less confident in its own value, until what had been a rich, socially embedded, medically endorsed, and genuinely pleasurable set of practices became, in the early modern European imagination, something between a distant memory and an embarrassing relic. Understanding how this happened requires holding several threads simultaneously. The medical legacy of the plague years that we explored in our last section, the moral and religious currents of the late medieval and Reformation periods, the economic disruptions that altered urban life in ways that undermined the commercial infrastructure of the public bathhouse, and the shifting social meanings of the body and its exposure that made the communal bathing space feel, to a later sensibility, transgressive in ways that it had not felt to an earlier one. None of these threads tells the whole story alone. Together, they weave something that is not simple decline but rather transformation, a genuine change in the culture of cleanliness that carried some things forward and left others behind, and that produced a world that was different in ways that mattered. The Reformation, which begins conventionally with Luther's posting of his theses in 1517, but which represents the culmination of reform impulses that had been building throughout the late medieval period, contributed to the changing landscape of bathing culture in ways that are more nuanced than the simple narrative of Protestant Puritanism suppressing Catholic sensuality would suggest. The Reformers' relationship with the body and its care was complicated. Luther himself was not, by any available evidence, a champion of bodily neglect, and the Reformation's general emphasis on individual conscience and domestic virtue could be read as supportive of private hygiene practice, even while it was deeply suspicious of the communal, potentially licentious space of the public bathhouse. What the Reformation did, in the regions where it took hold most thoroughly, was accelerate a process of moral reframing that the public bathhouse had been undergoing for at least a century before Luther arrived on the scene. The late medieval bathhouse had been living with its complicated dual reputation, legitimate hygienic establishment and venue for supplementary services, for long enough that the two functions had become increasingly difficult to disentangle in the public moral imagination. The regulatory efforts of municipal governments throughout the 14th and 15th centuries had not resolved this ambiguity but had instead codified it, producing a situation in which the bathhouse was simultaneously officially regulated as a legitimate institution and unofficially associated with the kind of behavior that reforming moralists, whether Catholic or Protestant, were increasingly inclined to address with considerable rhetorical force. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this final section is one of the most striking statistics in the history of European urban life. In many major European cities, the number of public bathhouses declined precipitously between roughly 1450 and 1600, from the dozens that had characterized the medieval urban landscape to a handful or, in some cities, none at all. Paris, which had maintained more than 24 bathhouses in the 13th century, had only a fraction of that number by the mid-16th century, and those that remained were operating under increasingly restrictive regulations and with increasingly uncertain social legitimacy. London's Southwark stews, which had operated under episcopal license for centuries, were officially closed by royal proclamation in 1546 under Henry VIII, ostensibly on public health grounds related to the spread of syphilis, though the moralistic dimensions of the closure were not difficult to read beneath the surface of the official justification. Syphilis deserves a moment's attention here, because it arrived in Europe in the 1490s, almost certainly introduced through the return of Columbus's crew from the Americas, though this origin story has its scholarly dissenters, and it immediately intensified the already fraught association between the bathhouse and disease. Unlike the plague, whose mechanism of transmission had been misread through the filter of miasmatic theory, syphilis presented a more legible epidemiological picture. At least at the level of popular observation, it was clearly, visibly, undeniably associated with sexual contact, and it spread rapidly through exactly the social networks that the bathhouse's supplementary services had connected. The closure of bathhouses on syphilis prevention grounds had, unlike the plague-era prohibition on bathing, a genuine epidemiological logic, not because bathing itself transmitted syphilis, but because the social activities that happened in some bathhouses genuinely did. This conflation, the legitimate bathhouse and the illegitimate one collapsed into a single condemned category, was one of the most consequential conceptual errors in the history of European hygiene. because it meant that the institutions that served genuine hygienic functions for the urban poor, the people who most needed them because they lacked private alternatives, were swept away along with the establishments that had provided other services under the same roof. The democratic dimension of the public bathhouse, its accessibility to people across the social spectrum, its provision of a hygienic resource to those who could not replicate it privately, was a casualty of a moral and epidemiological campaign that targeted the institution's most problematic aspects but destroyed its most valuable ones in the process. The economic disruptions of the late medieval period also played a significant role in undermining the commercial viability of the public bathhouse as an institution. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death and its subsequent waves had reduced urban populations dramatically, contracting the customer base that bathhouses depended on for commercial survival. The economic recovery of the 15th century was uneven and geographically variable, and in many cities the bathhouse infrastructure that had been damaged or abandoned during the plague years was never rebuilt to its former extent. The fuel costs that had always been a significant operating expense became more burdensome as population decline reduced the economies of scale that made urban bathhouse operation economically rational. The business model that had sustained dozens of bathhouses in a prosperous 13th century city simply did not function in the same way in a 15th century city still recovering from a century of demographic trauma. The shift toward private domestic bathing that we observed beginning in our soap-making section accelerated through this period, and it transformed the material culture of cleanliness in ways that are still visible in the physical spaces of early modern European houses. The dedicated bathing room, not the communal bathhouse, but the private domestic space designed specifically for washing, begins to appear in the households of the wealthy in the 15th and 16th centuries with increasing frequency. These spaces were still served by manual water heating and carrying rather than plumbing, still furnished with wooden tubs rather than fixed basins, still labor-intensive in ways that made them accessible only to households with sufficient servants to manage the process. But they represent a genuine architectural commitment to private bathing practice that had not previously been standard even in wealthy households, and their appearance signals a fundamental reorientation of how cleanliness was understood and organized. For those without the resources to create private bathing facilities, which was still the vast majority of the European population, the decline of the public bathhouse left a genuine gap that was filled imperfectly by various alternatives. The river and the stream, always a resource for the poor, became more important as institutional alternatives disappeared. The linen-based dry cleansing that late medieval medical theory had promoted as a safe alternative to water bathing became more prevalent by default as well as by choice. The partial wash, face and hands, the visible surfaces, the minimum required for social presentability, became even more emphatically the baseline in communities where access to more thorough washing was genuinely difficult. Here is the quirky detail that gives the long twilight of medieval bathing culture its most poignant human dimension. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, as the communal bathing tradition was declining across much of Europe, travelers from Western and Central Europe who visited Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic regions consistently noted with astonishment, and frequently with a complicated mixture of admiration and moral alarm, that the people they encountered there bathed regularly, communally, and with every apparent enjoyment in the sauna tradition that had persisted in these regions without interruption. The Finnish sauna, in particular, attracted commentary from travelers who were simultaneously impressed by the robust health of its practitioners and unsettled by the casual nudity and mixed-sex bathing that the tradition typically involved. These travelers were recording, from the outside, what a living communal bathing culture looked like, and their astonishment at what they were seeing tells you everything about how thoroughly the rest of Western Europe had lost touch with a tradition that had once been entirely normal. The medical theory that had condemned bathing during the plague continued to shape educated European attitudes toward water and the body well into the 17th century and beyond. The pore-opening logic, the fear that hot water made the body vulnerable to atmospheric corruption, was refined and elaborated by post-medieval physicians in ways that actually hardened the anti-bathing position rather than softening it. By the 17th century, some European physicians were advising against bathing not just during epidemics but as a general practice, recommending instead the regular changing of linen and the limited washing of only the most visible body surfaces. The person of quality in this medical framework demonstrated their sophistication and concern for their health precisely by not bathing, by relying instead on the clean linen and the careful management of environmental air that represented the most advanced hygienic thinking of their era. Historians still argue whether the 17th century, sometimes identified in popular accounts as the nadir of European personal hygiene, the point at which avoidance of water was most doctrinally entrenched among the educated classes, was genuinely worse in practical hygiene terms than the medieval period that preceded it, or whether the shift was primarily rhetorical, a change in the language and theory of cleanliness rather than in the actual practices. The evidence is mixed. Some early modern elites clearly did bathe less frequently than their medieval aristocratic predecessors had. Others maintained private bathing practices that the surviving documents do not record in detail because private domestic hygiene does not generate the same kind of institutional paper trail that public bathhouses do. The picture is complicated, and confident claims about hygiene at this period in either direction need to be held carefully. What we can say with confidence is that something was lost in the transition from the medieval to the early modern period, something real and significant in the culture of cleanliness that took centuries to recover, that was not fully restored until the sanitary reform movements of the 19th century began to rebuild the institutional infrastructure of public cleansing that the medieval world had maintained, imperfectly but genuinely, through its networks of urban bathhouses and communal washing spaces. The Victorian public baths, built in industrial cities across Britain and Europe in the mid-19th century specifically to provide washing facilities to the urban poor who lacked private alternatives, were, in a sense, a reinvention of something that the medieval world had already understood and already built, and that the intervening centuries had dismantled without adequately replacing. The medieval bathing world that we have traveled through tonight, the steaming tubs and herbal infusions of the aristocratic chamber, the noisy sociability of the urban bathhouse, the practical resourcefulness of the peasant's Saturday wash, the disciplined cleanliness of the monastic community, the chemical ingenuity of the soap maker's workshop, all of this represented a genuine and sophisticated engagement with one of the most basic human needs, organized through institutions and practices and beliefs that were different from ours but no less serious in their intentions and no less effective, within their own terms, in their results. The myth that replaced this reality, the myth of the uniformly dirty, hygiene-indifferent medieval world, was not just inaccurate. It was a form of forgetting, and like most forms of forgetting, it revealed more about the people doing the forgetting than about the thing being forgotten. The early modern period that constructed this myth was itself in the process of losing something it had once had, and the contempt for medieval hygienic practice was at least partly a way of not looking too directly at what was being given up and why, and what the loss actually meant for the ordinary people who had depended most on the institutions being dismantled. What was given up was community, the community of the bathhouse, of the laundry stream, of the communal sauna, of the shared tub and the shared water and the shared space of physical vulnerability and social ease. What replaced it was privacy, which has its own real value but which carries, for the poor and the isolated, a cost that the wealthy and the connected rarely have to pay. The medieval bathhouse was imperfect, complicated, morally fraught, and sometimes genuinely dangerous. It was also warm and social and accessible, and it served a real human need in a way that the private alternatives that replaced it simply could not do for everyone. That warmth, the literal, physical warmth of heated water in a shared space, the social warmth of community gathered around the common human need to be clean, is perhaps the thing most worth remembering as we draw tonight's journey to its close. And now, as we reach the end of this long and quietly remarkable journey through the bathing world of medieval Europe, it is time to let the story settle, to let the steam disperse and the water cool and the voices of the bathhouse fade into something softer and more distant, like music heard from another room, still beautiful but no longer insistent. You have traveled far tonight. You have moved through Roman ruins and monastery gardens, through crowded bathhouses and quiet noble chambers, through plague-struck cities and fragrant soap workshops, through all the complicated human, surprisingly warm reality of a world that cared more about cleanliness than we ever gave it credit for. You have met people who heated water with patient care and perfumed it with roses, who built institutions to make cleanliness available to everyone, who wrote recipe books full of herbal wisdom, who bathed together in the spirit of community and friendship and the uncomplicated pleasure of warm water on tired skin. Let that warmth stay with you now, as the words begin to slow and the images soften at their edges. Let the medieval bathhouse become, in your imagination, a place of peace rather than history. Just the heat, just the steam, just the quiet sound of water moving in a wooden tub, just the faint fragrance of lavender and rose drifting through a space where people came, day after day, century after century, to do the simplest and most human thing imaginable. To be clean, to be together, to be, for an hour in warm water, simply and completely at rest. The candle is burning low. The musician has stopped playing. The water is still. And you, wherever you are tonight, tucked into your bed, drifting on the edge of sleep, letting the day dissolve around you like herbs in a warm bath. You are part of this long human story too. Every person who has ever sighed with relief into warm water, who has ever felt the specific, irreplaceable comfort of clean skin and clean linen and the permission to stop, just stop and rest. Every one of them is with you in this moment, reaching back across the centuries in the only way that history ever truly reaches us, which is through the body, through the senses, through the quiet recognition that the things that matter to them are the things that matter to us still. Sleep now. The water is warm. The story is complete. And somewhere in the soft dark behind your closed eyes, a medieval bathhouse is still open, still steaming, still full of voices, and the door is always, always unlocked.